We were running on grit and cheap instant coffee, deep in the Olympic National Forest, August 1967. The air was a heavy, suffocating sponge of wet moss and ancient pine, tasting metallic and cold even though the sun was doing its best to penetrate the triple canopy. It was supposed to be 2 weeks of primitive respite, just me, Leo, and Rick, escaping the stifling concrete heat of Seattle. Our camp was a sloppy arrangement of olive-drab nylon tents near a tributary of the Queets River. The water sounded a constant, monotonous gurgle that drowned out everything else, including the static coming from Leo's tiny transistor radio. Leo was the designated worrier. He was thin, jittery, perpetually smelling of stale smoke and anxiety, and insisted on checking the perimeter every hour, even in the middle of the night. Rick, conversely, was noise and bulk, a skeptic who laughed too loud and drank too much warm Lucky Lager. He spent the first 2 days cracking jokes about the local timbermen's tales, stories about the hairy man living deep in the unexplored ridges, a ghost legend meant to scare kids away from logging trails. Our routine was a fragile thing. Fish the creek in the morning, chop the damp cedar for the nightly fire, and spend the afternoons arguing about the Vietnam draft. The real fatigue wasn't physical, though. It was the damp, bone-chilling isolation that seeped into everything. The shift started subtle, an almost imperceptible change in the soundscape. Usually, the woods are loud, a chorus of insects, birds, the snapping of small branches. By the 4th day, the noise had been replaced by a silence so absolute it felt heavy, manufactured. Leo noticed it first, stopping mid-sentence while cleaning his reel, his head tilted back. "It's empty," he mumbled, his voice too quiet. Not quiet, empty, like everything with a heartbeat packed up and left. Rick told him he needed more sleep, but even Rick stopped laughing when, an hour later, we found the first anomaly. We were following a deer trail, looking for drier firewood. We broke into a small, boggy clearing where the forest floor looked pulverized. It wasn't natural erosion. It looked like a bulldozer had pivoted repeatedly in the same spot, mashing the thick layer of ferns and moss into black, wet earth. Then, the smell hit, sharp and musky, like stale ammonia mixed with wet dog hair, overwhelming the usual scent of decay. Standing at the edge of the clearing were 3 enormous logs. They were cedar, likely 7 feet long and thicker than a utility pole, snapped clean in the middle. They hadn't fallen. They had been deliberately, brutally broken and leaned together to form a crude, conical structure, like a monstrous teepee. It would have taken serious heavy equipment to position them, yet we were miles from the nearest logging road. I walked closer, reaching out to touch the lowest log. The wood was cold, but the moss beneath it, where the structure met the earth, radiated a faint, disturbing warmth. As I pulled my hand back, I saw the indentation on the soft ground near the base, a massive print, far wider than any boot, the toes impossibly blunt, pressing down with crushing, unmistakable authority. It wasn't the footprint that terrified me. It was the realization that whatever made it was capable of this impossible construction and had chosen to make its shelter right here. It wasn't the footprint that terrified me. It was the realization that whatever made it was capable of this impossible construction and had chosen to make its shelter right here. I stared at the impression pressed into the damp soil, the edges already beginning to pool with water from the rising condensation. A sharp, metallic scent, like ozone before a storm or perhaps just cold, thin air, suddenly overpowered the usual smells of pine needles and decaying loam. My heart started that heavy, wet thumping against my ribs. 20 yards away, Ben was whistling cheerfully, arranging the heavy cast-iron skillet on the portable stove. He was oblivious. I needed to call him over, to show him this undeniable evidence, but my throat was tight, clogged with a fear that demanded silence. To confirm the existence of this thing would make it real, and that reality felt like falling from a great height. The clearing, which had been bathed in warm, angled sunlight just moments earlier, suddenly felt dense and cold. I realized the volume had dropped. The normal background noise of the forest, the high whine of the cicadas, the fluttering of small birds, the distant rush of the creek, had ceased. Not gradually, but instantly, as if the sound had been vacuumed out of the valley. The silence was absolute, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. The temperature plummeted. I felt the sudden drop in my lungs, a sharp, almost painful intake of burning cold air. Ben stopped whistling mid-note, straightened up, and looked around, his expression shifting from genial calm to puzzled alarm. "Hey," he muttered, his voice too loud in the sudden void. "Did you hear that?" Or, well, not hear that. The air felt dead. Still, the metallic odor grew stronger, mixing now with something foul and musky, like wet, stale wool and urine, overlaid with a strange, cloying sweetness, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. Then the sound came. It wasn't a twig snap or the groan of a tree shifting in the wind. It was a rhythmic, heavy thud. It came from the dense stand of Douglas firs directly behind our small camp, slightly uphill from the crude structure I'd found. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded deliberate, slow, and impossibly powerful. It was the sound of something wet and heavy striking hardwood, far above ground level. Ben grabbed the handle of his small axe, a useless gesture against an unknown enemy. His face was pale. "Probably just a dead limb falling, George," he managed, his attempt at rationalization sounding desperate and thin. "Pressure changes can cause that, you know. Or maybe a big bull moose rubbing an itch." But we both knew moose don't knock. They don't sound like weighted fists beating against a hollow drum, moving with relentless, unwavering rhythm. The thudding stopped just as abruptly as the forest had gone silent. It was replaced by a dragging, scraping sound, like rough stone or bone being pulled across dry lumber, followed by a sickeningly faint crack, as if something brittle had just given way high up in the dense canopy above our heads. We stood motionless, eyes wide and focused on the black shadow of the trees, waiting for the sound that would finally confirm that the mundane rules of the world no longer applied here. We didn't hear the sound we expected. Instead, a silence returned that was heavier than the one before the drumming, weighted down by the knowledge that whatever caused the noise was still out there, just waiting. We spent the rest of that night staring at the tent ceiling, heartbeats pounding out a counter-rhythm to the low thrumming anxiety that had suddenly become our permanent companion. The next day, the forest seemed less like a wilderness escape and more like a poorly maintained prison. Doug and Mark tried to convince themselves it was a prank, maybe a large bear, or a tree falling, but their voices lacked conviction, the words tasting like dry sawdust in the humid air. The second night was when the true psychological rot set in. It didn't rely on the distant, heavy impacts this time. It used proximity. Around 3 in the morning, I was jarred awake not by a sudden noise, but by a subtle shift in the air pressure, accompanied by a foul, overwhelming odor. A thick, wet smell like decaying foliage mixed with fresh ozone and the metallic tang of something that had been dead for a week. It was right outside the tent wall, so close I could almost feel the heat radiating off it. The sounds were precise, deliberate. Not scratches from branches, but the sickening schluck of heavy, wet soles compressing the mud just beyond our flimsy boundary. Then came the breathing. Not human, not animal, but a deep, rattling chest rumble, slow and incredibly powerful, like bellows working underwater. We were trapped. Every sound was magnified. A piece of pine bark slid off the canvas roof and hit the ground with the sound of a pistol shot. Doug cursed under his breath, his nerves shredded. He hadn't slept for nearly 48 hours and now refused to put the camp lantern out, its weak yellow light casting dancing shadows that made the inner tent look like a carnival house of horrors. We started fighting over trivial things. Who had used the last of the coffee? Who wasn't pulling their weight-setting traps? Anything to distract from the omnipresent wait outside. But it was Leo who truly unnerved me. While Mark and Doug became jumpy and paranoid, constantly scanning the woods with desperate eyes, Leo grew quiet. He stopped arguing. He stopped trying to rationalize. He just stared. He was obsessed, not with fear, but with understanding. Last night, I woke to the sound of soft, wet earth being disturbed, right next to my head. I froze, expecting the worst, but the sound came from inside the tent. Leo was sitting up, his silhouette hunched in the dim lantern glow. He wasn't looking at the canvas wall. He was looking down at his own hand. He slowly, painstakingly, ran his fingertip along the dusty tent floor, tracing an imaginary line that mimicked the shallow depression he claimed to see just outside. A depression he whispered was a perfect, five-toed impression pressed into the damp soil. His eyes, wide and unnaturally reflective, were crashing through the undergrowth, but the thought of moving, of shattering the brittle, profound silence of the night, felt like an act of suicide. My companion hadn't moved. He was still crouched, staring at the invisible indentation in the floor, his breath coming in high, shallow gasps that sounded like dry leaves scraping together. Then came the sound. It wasn't a branch breaking or a familiar animal cry. It was a wet, congested inhale, impossibly deep, like a massive, ancient bellows being slowly filled with humid air. It came from directly outside, maybe 15 feet away, right where we'd left the cooling coals of the fire pit. It smelled us. I forced my head to turn, my neck muscles screaming under the strain of resistance, and focused on the small, cloudy plastic window flap near the zipper. It was too dark. The moon was only a sliver, mostly blocked by the ceiling of ancient pines. But that sliver of light was suddenly, completely gone. It wasn't just a shadow. Shadows dissipate. They don't absorb light. This was a wall of blackness, dense and vertical, too vast to be any known creature. My breath seized in my throat. I couldn't exhale. The air tasted of copper and old, pulverized dirt. It was impossibly tall, easily 8 feet, maybe more, hunched and slightly swaying. The silhouette was ragged, covered in matted hair that looked wet and greasy, even in the darkness. It shifted, and I could feel the microscopic tremor in the ground beneath my sleeping bag. The smell hit me next, a thick, suffocating musk of spoiled meat, stale sweat, and something fundamentally feral, an odor that belonged in a cave or at the bottom of a swamp. It moved with a sickening, deliberate slowness, rotating its massive head, not searching, but simply acknowledging. When its face was aligned with the tent, its eyes caught the scattered light from the residual embers, not a glow, but a dull, horrifying reflection, deep amber or rusted red, like polished stones seen through fog. They were wide-set and completely without intelligence, yet radiating a crushing, proprietary awareness. It took one heavy, weighted step toward the tent. The sound was not a stomp, but a dull thud that resonated through my skull. It raised one immense, blunt hand. The fingers were thick, dark columns against the pale canvas, and it ran those blunt tips along the exact path my friend had traced minutes earlier, the path where it supposedly measured how much space we occupied. It wasn't a strike. It was a confirmation. My rationale shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't folklore. This was dense, stinking, impossible flesh and bone, and it knew exactly where we were. It let out a final sound, not a roar or a grunt, but a low, subterranean vibration that seemed to come from the roots of the trees themselves, echoing up through my jawbone. It was the sound of ownership. ND had traced minutes earlier, the path where it supposedly measured how much space we occupied. It wasn't a strike. It was a confirmation. My rationale shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't folklore. This was dense, stinking, impossible flesh and bone, and it knew exactly where we were. It let out a final sound, not a roar or a grunt, but a low, subterranean vibration that seemed to come from the roots of the trees themselves, echoing up through my jawbone. It was the sound of ownership, and that noise flipped a switch inside me from paralyzed fear to pure, chemical flight. Jerry was faster. He snatched the keys from the fold-out picnic table and hurled himself toward the battered Ford Fairlane, screaming my name. But the sound was thin, fragile, swallowed instantly by the sheer, encompassing density of the forest. I followed, scrambling over the damp, yielding earth, the coarse pine needles tearing painfully at my palms as I fell, and immediately picked myself up. My ankle twisted hard on an unseen root, sending a lightning bolt of white-hot pain up my shin, but I didn't feel the pain, only the cold, crushing urgency of survival. We had maybe 20 feet to the car. 20 feet felt like a mile across an open field. Jerry was already inside, his hands shaking so badly the keys rattled against the tumbler before he finally jammed them home. He cranked the ignition. Arrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr. The sound was weak, tired, the asthmatic wheeze of an old, cold engine drowning in the humid, stinking night air. He tried again. Arrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr the failed start was absolute, worse than the creature's vibration. It emphasized how exposed we were, framed perfectly by the windshield. I slammed the passenger door shut, the ancient metal protesting with a loud, hollow clang that felt like a gunshot in the still air. I barely got the latch secured before the creature emerged from the shadow line between the tent and the fire pit. It wasn't running. It was moving with an impossible, sickening economy of motion, gliding over the uneven ground. It was taller than the car, a colossal, wet mass of shadow and muscle. Its head barely tilted to examine us, but I could smell it now. Rotting meat, old moss, and something sharp, like stale urine mixed with the metallic tang of ozone. The smell burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. "Trunk," Jerry yelled, his voice cracking, spat back out by the closed cabin. "We gotta get the spare gas can. It might be flooded." He threw himself out of the driver's side, fumbling for the trunk release near the bumper. That was his mistake. That small, unnecessary delay, the moment he exposed his back to the woods. I didn't see the movement, only the result. An arm, thicker than my torso, came down with the hydraulic speed of a pile driver. It didn't swipe, it grasped. It caught Jerry around the chest and midriff, lifting him clean off the ground. There was a wet, sickening, muffled crunch, a sound that wasn't loud but was utterly final, like stepping on a fragile birdcage. Jerry didn't scream. He just made a terrible, bubbling, gurgling sound as his feet kicked uselessly at the air, his face turning an immediate, terrible purple under the faint moonlight. I didn't wait. The primal, blinding terror took over, silencing everything but the desperate need for a way. I clawed at the passenger door handle, threw myself out, and hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth loose. I rolled, feeling the gritty, metallic, oily dirt against my cheek. I could hear the heavy, raspy breathing of the thing right above me. The car frame rattled slightly as its immense weight shifted. I scrambled out the other side, abandoning the useless road, plunging straight into the dense, black woods. I didn't care about direction. I just ran, the sounds of my own ragged, gasping breath and the sharp, snapping branches my only reality. I risked one glance back. The thing was still standing there, its massive shape backlit by the dying embers of our campfire, holding Jerry's limp body like a discarded rag doll. It hadn't pursued me yet. It was savoring the silence, claiming the kill. I felt the sharp, immediate warmth of my own bladder emptying into my pants, a final, humiliating surrender to the terror, and kept running deeper, blindly, into the overwhelming, choking dark, praying the trees were thick enough to hide me until the sun rose. If the sun ever rose again. I ran for hours. When the dawn finally bled through the thick canopy, gray and weak, I was huddled under a hollowed cedar, shivering, my throat raw. I smelled like urine, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of pure adrenaline that hadn't faded. The sun didn't bring warmth, only a dreadful clarity to the shadows. I made it to the logging road sometime around mid-morning, dragging my useless legs. A trucker found me, staring blankly at the dust, and mistook me for a derelict, muttering incoherently about Mark and Jerry and the smell of wet dog and ozone. The police were clinical, bored. They searched. They found the camp, the fire extinguished, the gear scattered, and blood, too much of it, at the edge of the clearing. But Jerry's body? Gone. Mark's tent was torn, not sliced, but ripped from top to bottom, like wet paper. They found no tracks that fit my description, only bare prints, conveniently large, leading away into the denser growth. They logged it as a fatal bear encounter coupled with 2 missing persons, probably driven mad by the isolation and then consumed by scavengers. They looked at me, the filthy, hysterical kid babbling about eyes the size of teacups and a smell like rotten meat, and saw a prime candidate for a psych evaluation. They didn't even bother to hide their pitying skepticism. They tried to help me forget. The doctors prescribed pills that made the world float and tasted like copper pennies. But the forgetting never took hold. How can you forget the moment reality unzips itself? Sarah, the one who stayed by the truck, she eventually made it back to civilization, too. She didn't speak about the darkness. She only spoke about the silence, the absolute, profound quiet that followed Jerry's scream. She's institutionalized now, staring at ceiling tiles, refusing to be left alone in a room without at least 3 working light bulbs. The silence broke her completely. I know they think I'm sick, traumatized, or lying. I gave up arguing years ago. I live inland now, far from the heavy scent of old pines and the crushing stillness of the north woods. But sometimes, when the streetlights just kill Jerry and break Sarah, it broke the world. And I know, with cold, absolute certainty, that even now, when the moonlight hits the distant